She thought he was just a broke drifter until he returned in a limousine wearing a suit and holding a ring. What he revealed next shattered everything. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Excuse me, came the unfamiliar voice, low, calm, laced with a faint American twang. Becca Stein glanced up from her ledger, her pen stalling mid-stroke. The sun was slipping behind the cliffs of Fairhaven Bay, casting golden shadows across the front porch of her seaside in sea-glass shores. The man standing at the front gate looked entirely out of place, dusty jeans, a torn backpack slung over one shoulder, and a denim jacket worn thin. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sorry to bother you," he said, stepping toward her cautiously. "I lost my wallet. I've been backpacking across the states and got separated from my group." Becca narrowed her eyes. She was 34 now, not 20, and long past taking strangers at their word. "And somehow you wound up here in a sleepy harbor town in Oregon? No transit lines, no hotels open this time of year?" The man lifted both hands in mock surrender. "It's a long story." "I'm sure it is," she replied, standing as she crossed her arms over her chest. "What exactly do you want?" "Just a place to crash for the night," he said. "I can work, mop floors, fix something. I just need shelter till morning." Becca scanned the empty street behind him. Fairhaven was quiet in the off-season, and she didn't want another repeat of last spring when a so-called quiet drifter tried to raid her pantry after too much whiskey. "No vacancies," she said curtly. "Your sign says rooms available," he pointed out, gesturing toward the post near the stairs. Her brow arched. "Not for drifters without ID and a convincing story." He blinked, then gave a slow nod. "Fair enough. Sorry to trouble you." Turning away, he walked down the gravel path toward the cliffs without another word. Becca watched him for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then she turned back inside, heart firm from too many hard lessons. It wasn't until 2 hours later, when the wind picked up and the rain came down in hard, slanting sheets, that she saw him again. Through the window, his silhouette was hunched on the wooden bench beneath the awning, jacket wrapped tight, head bowed to shield from the storm. "Damn it," Becca muttered. With a frustrated sigh, she snatched a towel and swung open the door. "Hey," she called. The man looked up, his face pale and lips tinged with blue. She sighed again, heavier this time. "Get in here before you drown." He dried off by the fire while she made tea, grumbling to herself the whole time. She set the steaming mug on the table in front of him without meeting his eyes. "Thanks," he said softly. "Don't thank me," she snapped. "You're staying in the supply room. Don't touch anything. Don't take anything. And if you so much as sneeze wrong, I'm calling the sheriff." He managed a faint smile. "Got it." She glanced over at him. "What's your name?" "Dean." "That's all I get?" He shrugged. "I'll earn the rest." By the next morning, the storm had passed, and so had most of her irritation. Dean had been up before sunrise, cleaned the lounge without being asked, and even chopped firewood behind the inn. She found him there stacking logs, a towel slung over his shoulder, his hair still damp. "You're not scared of hard work," she observed. "Nope," he replied. "Not scared of much, except maybe parrots. Creepy little things." She smirked despite herself. He stayed another night, then another. Each day, he fixed something that had been broken for ages. Leaky faucets, warped floorboards, a cracked window in room 3. He even cooked simple dinners for the two of them. He still didn't say much about his past, but he listened when she talked. Felt strange having someone else around. For nearly 2 years after her mother's passing, Becca had run Seaglass Shores in on her own, turning down every offer to buy it out and convert it into a trendy spa retreat. She didn't trust easily, not since what happened with Drew. But Dean was different. She still didn't fully trust him either, but she noticed the way he never asked for more than he was given. Even when his hands blistered or his boots soaked through, he never complained. He just worked. And waited. Waited like someone with nowhere else to be. One evening, as they sat on the back deck watching waves crash beneath the cliffs, Dean broke the quiet. "Thanks," he said. "For what?" "For not leaving me out in that storm." Becca shot him a look. "I almost did." He chuckled. "Yeah, but you didn't." She didn't reply, but something stirred in her chest, something warm and dangerous. Maybe it was the firelight. Maybe it was the way he watched the sea like it whispered secrets only he could hear. Or maybe it was how she had begun to look for him in the mornings without realizing it. Whatever it was, it didn't feel safe. And Becca wasn't ready for not safe. Her days ran like clockwork, she ran her in like a naval officer. Towels folded with military precision, every guest file color-coded, breakfast served at 7:30 on the dot. Dean, on the other hand, seemed to drift through each day like it was improvised jazz. He'd hum old tunes while sweeping the porch, wander barefoot through the garden, strike up casual chats with the rare off-season guests. "Do you always whistle while you work?" she asked one morning, watching him clean the front windows. "Also, wrong side of the squeegee." Dean grinned. "Only when I'm in a good mood." Becca folded her arms. "You've been sleeping in the storage room doing grunt work for weeks. What exactly are you so cheerful about?" He shrugged. "Sun's shining. I've got coffee. A roof over my head. That's more than a lot of people get." She couldn't argue. But it annoyed her anyway, his unshakable calm, his quiet joy. He didn't fit into her tidy, scheduled world. And yet he was still here. "Why are you still here?" she asked one evening as they locked up the inn. Dean tilted his head. "Do you want me gone?" She hesitated. "That's not what I asked. I'm still here because I like it. It's peaceful. Ocean view. Good soup." She rolled her eyes. "Not exactly a compelling reason. I've stayed for less." She didn't know what he meant. And he didn't explain. Dean never talked about his past, not once. He joked, worked, and listened. But when things got personal, he ducked and weaved like a prizefighter. Becca kept her own walls up too. Not out of coldness, but survival. You could see it in how she stiffened at compliments, how she pulled back when someone stood too close. One afternoon, as they painted the picket fence, Dean asked casually, "So, who broke your heart?" She didn't answer. Just handed him the brush and walked away. Later that night, taped to his door, he found a note. "Don't ask questions if you're not ready for the answers." He smiled and never brought it up again. But something kept shifting between them, subtle, unexpected moments that slipped through the cracks. Like when she found him trying to bake banana bread and mistook salt for sugar. She laughed so hard she had to sit down, her first real laugh in months. Or the night the power cut during a storm. Dean lit candles in the dining room and told ghost stories in an exaggerated cowboy drawl until she was in tears from laughing. Or the morning she overslept, a rare, unsettling thing, and stumbled into the kitchen to find breakfast cooked, dishes washed, and hot coffee waiting. "You're slipping," Dean teased, sipping from her favorite mug. "Thought you were a hospitality ninja." "Don't get used to it," she mumbled, cheeks pink. She didn't understand what this was between them. It wasn't just attraction. It was something else, quieter, deeper. A kind of belonging that didn't ask for permission. And somehow Dean didn't feel lonely anymore when Dean was in it. Still, she kept her distance. She didn't ask about the phone she'd once seen him lock in a drawer. Didn't ask how someone broke could speak perfect French to a tourist. Or why he avoided town. Or why he sometimes stared at the sea like it was whispering his name. Whatever shadows they carried, they learned to coexist with them. For now, that was enough. But deep down, they both knew that kind of fragile peace never lasted long. That night, the wind howled like a wounded animal, slamming against the shutters and pounding the cliffs below. Becca stood by the back door of the inn, her raincoat cinched tight, flashlight in hand. A strange rattling had been coming from the old utility shed at the far edge of the property for over an hour. She'd ignored it at first, but now a familiar itch, half instinct, half habit, pushed her into the storm. Dean had offered to check it earlier. She'd waved him off. "I can handle it," she'd said. She always said that. The wind yanked at the door as she stepped out, nearly pulling it from her grasp. Rain hammered her face as she trudged down the muddy slope, flashlight beam jittering with every step. She didn't see the loose stone. Her boot slipped. She cried out as she tumbled, skidding down the hill toward the cliffs, flashlight flying from her grip. She hit a narrow ledge hard, gasping in pain. Her ankle twisted beneath her. She couldn't move. Rain poured down her face as she clawed at the grass, trying to pull herself up. But gravity had won. And then footsteps. "Becca!" Dean's voice, frantic, echoed above. "Down here," she shouted hoarsely. His face appeared at the edge seconds later. He didn't hesitate. Ignoring her warning, he began sliding down, using tree roots and rocks for support. His jacket tore as he braced himself, feet expertly finding traction where hers hadn't. When he reached her, he dropped to his knees. "Where does it hurt?" "My ankle," she gasped. "I can't stand." Without another word, he scooped her up. His arms were strong but trembling under her weight. Rain streaked across his face, mixing with the blood dripping from a cut on his forearm. "You're hurt," she whispered, dazed. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Let's just get you out of here." Step by step, Dean climbed back up the hill, slipping once but never falling, never letting go of her. When they reached the inn, he shouldered the door open and carried her to the sofa by the fireplace. She was shivering, soaked, teeth chattering. He grabbed towels and blankets, anything he could find, wrapping her carefully like she was fragile. "You should have let me check that damn shed," he said softly. She opened her mouth to reply, but choked instead. Tears poured down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater. "Becca?" he asked gently. She leaned forward, burying her face in his shoulder. Her arms wrapped around him tightly. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. He held her without a word, strong and steady. "I've got you," he murmured. "You're okay. I've got you." They sat like that for a long time, firelight flickering around them. The storm outside raged on, but inside, something had irrevocably shifted. Not with a kiss. Not with a confession. With a fall, a rescue, and an embrace that didn't ask questions. Dean was unusually quiet the next morning. The last weekend guest had checked out early and the storm had faded to a soft breeze. Becca wandered the hallway with a mug in hand, enjoying the stillness until she heard a voice. Familiar but muffled. Urgent. It came from the kitchen window. "I told you, not yet," Dean said, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard. "No, I'm not coming back. I need more time." Pause. "Yeah, I know what's at stake. But I meant what I said. I'll handle it." Becca froze. The voice was unmistakably his, firm, American, clear. But the words? They didn't belong to the carefree handyman who baked terrible banana bread and patched up fences for fun. She moved closer, peeking between the curtains. Dean stood at the edge of the garden, phone pressed to his ear. But it wasn't the old cracked flip phone he always tossed on the kitchen counter. This one was sleek, modern, and hidden in the inside pocket of his coat. When the call ended, he slipped it away, and that was when Becca stepped outside. "Interesting call," she said coolly. Dean turned slowly, caught mid-step. "Becca, I didn't hear you." "No kidding," she said, folding her arms. "Who were you talking to?" He blinked. "It was just." "Don't lie." The silence between them snapped tight like a rubber band. Finally, Dean sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's complicated." "That's not an answer," she snapped. "Why?" she demanded. "Because you're not who you pretend to be? Because you've had a second phone this whole time, one you've been hiding?" He looked down. "Guilty." "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "Becca, just listen." "No," her voice cracked. "I let you into my home. I gave you trust one don't give to anyone." "I never asked for that," he said softly. "I told you I was passing through. And yet you stayed. You made me believe you were just some wanderer with a good heart and a busted backpack." His expression changed, pain flashing through his eyes. "You think this has all been some kind of con?" "I don't know what to think," she said honestly. "Because I don't know who the hell you are." He took a step forward. "Just give me time. Please." "Time for what?" she asked. "To vanish in the middle of the night? To call your mystery contact and tell them your job's done?" Dean's jaw clenched. "That's not fair." She didn't budge. "I want you out. Today." He stared at her for a long second, like he had more to say, but then nodded once. "I understand." He walked past her, up the stairs, and began to pack. She didn't watch him go. But when she heard the click of the front door an hour later, it echoed louder than any storm. The days after Dean left were harder than Becca expected. Seaglass Shores Inn felt hollow without him. Too quiet. Too still. The absence of his humming, his ridiculous ghost stories, even the clatter of him messing up her kitchen, it all dug under her skin. But pride is louder than longing. And she'd made her choice. Then came the morning everything changed. It started like every other, fresh coffee, hum of the space heater, and her father, Mr. Stein, sitting in his usual chair by the bay window, sipping tea and watching the waves. Becca was pouring his second cup when she heard it, a harsh gasp. Then his hand slipped from the table. "Dad," she said, panicked. He tried to speak, but his words were garbled. His eyes rolled back. "Dad," she cried out, the teacup shattering on the floor as she rushed to him. His body slumped, breathing shallow, non-responsive. Her hands trembled as she scrambled for her phone, but it slipped from her fingers, skidding beneath the counter. "Somebody help," she screamed. "Please." And then Dean. Soaked from the rain, wild-eyed, breathless, he burst through the door like a human hurricane. He dropped to his knees beside her father, scanned the scene, and said quickly, "He's having a stroke. Call 911. "My phone, it's gone," Becca stammered. Dean was already dialing from his. "Fairhaven General Hospital," he told the dispatcher. "One possible stroke victim. Elderly male. We need paramedics now." Dean began chest compressions with calm precision, guiding Becca as she knelt beside him, holding her father's hand. "Stay with us, sir," Dean said, voice steady. "Come on. Keep breathing." Becca's vision blurred with tears. He wasn't supposed to be here, but he'd never really left. Minutes later, the paramedics arrived. They took over, and Becca followed them outside, clinging to her father's hand until the ambulance doors closed. Dean stood in the background, rain dripping from his coat, saying nothing. When the ambulance disappeared down the road, Becca turned to him, raw and exhausted. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her like he'd been waiting for that question. "I stayed close," he said. "Just in case." "In case of what?" Her voice cracked. "In case I broke again?" "No," he replied. "In case you needed someone, even if you didn't want it to be me." "You saved his life," she whispered. Dean took a cautious step closer. "He's your dad. And you." He stopped himself. "You're not just the innkeeper in a coastal town I stumbled into. Then what am I?" He swallowed hard. "You're the only place that's ever felt like home." Becca stared at him, stunned. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and the aching weight of every word he just said. Tears welled up again, but not from fear this time. She reached for his hand and held it tightly. "I don't know who you are, Dean," she whispered. "I don't know why you lied. Or what you're hiding." He didn't flinch. "But I know one thing," she continued. "You didn't have to come back. But you did." "I never really left," he said. "Not in here." He pressed his hand over his chest. And in that moment, for the first time, Becca believed him. The days that followed were a blur. Her father was stable, slowly recovering at Fairhaven General Hospital, and she spent most of her time at his side. But her thoughts constantly drifted back to Dean. Until suddenly he was gone again. No note. No goodbye. No trace. It was as if the man who saved her father had vanished into thin air. Becca searched past the marina, through the winding lanes of the village, even asked at the coffee shop. No one had seen him. Maybe he was never meant to stay. 3 days later, everything changed again. It started with a sound Becca had never heard on her street, the low, luxurious purr of an expensive engine. A black limousine pulled up in front of the inn. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Whispers filled the wind. Someone famous? Rich American? Becca stood behind the counter of Seaglass Shores, frozen. The car door opened. First, a man in a gray suit with an earpiece. Then another, navy-suited, holding a leather folio. And finally Dean. But not the Dean she knew. He stepped out like someone born into another world. His tailored charcoal suit fit like armor, his hair swept back, his shoes gleaming. His entire presence commanded attention. Gone were the frayed jeans, the work-calloused hands, the crooked smile over burnt toast. Becca couldn't breathe. Dean walked toward the door, assistant and bodyguard in tow. When the door opened, the old reception bell jingled, a sound far too ordinary for such a surreal moment. He paused at the threshold. "Becca," he said quietly. She didn't answer. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp and guarded. "I came to explain." "Explain what?" she snapped. "That you've been lying since day one?" "I didn't lie," he said, his voice calm. "I just didn't tell the whole truth." She laughed, dry, cold. "That's the same thing." He stepped forward. "My name is Dean Whitmore. My family owns Whitmore Media Group, based out of Manhattan." Becca's heart skipped a beat. "I needed to get away from the politics, the cameras, the pressure. I wanted something real." "So you played poor and landed in my inn?" she asked bitterly. "That was your escape?" "No," he said quickly. "I wasn't supposed to stay. I got off at the wrong stop. Found this place. It felt peaceful. And then you stayed in my house. Ate at my table. Slept under my roof," she said, voice trembling. "You pretended to be someone else." "I didn't pretend," he insisted. "I became who I really am. With you." Becca looked down. Her hands curled into fists on the countertop. "You let me fall for a lie." "I fell too," he whispered. "Harder than I ever expected." She looked up at him. This man in the $1,000 suit, standing in the same spot where a barefoot, rain-soaked stranger had once knelt beside her father and saved a life. "You should leave," she said, barely above a whisper. Dean's jaw tensed. "Please, just let me say what I came to say." "Why?" she asked. "So you can clear your conscience before heading back to your penthouse?" "No," he replied. "So I can tell you that none of it matters. Not the money, not the company, not the suit. The only thing that's ever been real was you." She didn't answer. Dean slowly placed a slim envelope on the counter. "This is the deed, transferring full ownership of Seaglass Shores to you. No strings, no publicity, just protection. In case you ever need it." She didn't touch it. He turned toward the door. The whispers outside picked up again. Becca stood behind the glass, watching as Dean climbed into the limousine, the driver pulling away onto the cobbled road. He hadn't returned as a drifter. He'd returned like royalty. But the man she missed had never needed a crown. A week passed. Guests came and went. Her father grew stronger. And Becca did what she did best, pushed the ache aside and buried herself in routine. Until the bell over the door chimed again. She turned, expecting a traveler. Instead, it was Dean. No bodyguards. No suit. Just Dean. Shirt slightly wrinkled, familiar boots, tired eyes, and something unguarded in his expression. "You're back," she said, stunned. "I had to be. You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said gently. "But I had to try one more time." He stepped closer and placed a worn leather folder on the counter. "My file," he said. "My ID. My family background. Everything. No secrets. No pretense. You expect me to believe that changes anything?" "No," Dean said softly. "But I need you to understand. I didn't come to Oregon to lie. I came because I needed to stop being someone I never chose to become. And I gave you that," she said, voice cracking. "I gave you something real. I know. And I'll carry that forever." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Then he dropped to one knee. Becca froze. "I'm not offering you Whitmore Media. Or my name. Or a life in the spotlight," he said. "I'm offering you the most broken, honest parts of myself, the parts that no one else gets to see. I want to love you with nothing but what's real. Because that's all I've ever been with you." Her lips parted, but no words came. "I have everything," Dean whispered. "But it means nothing without you." He opened the box, simple ring, no diamonds, just honesty in gold. "I know you don't trust easily. I know I hurt you. But trust this," he placed his hand over his chest. "This is the only part of me that never lied." Becca stared down at him, shaking. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. She didn't take the ring. She took his hand. "I still hate banana bread," she whispered. Dean laughed, tears in his eyes. "I'll never bake again." And in that crooked little inn by the sea, with salt in the air and silence between them, she forgave him. And that was everything. 1 year later, the sea-glass shores in looked like something out of a storybook. White roses climbed the trellises, ribbons fluttered in the ocean breeze, and fairy lights twinkled across the garden trees. Guests filled the lawn, locals from Fairhaven, staff from the Whitmore Foundation, and a few quiet faces from New York. But no grand cathedral could have meant more. Because this wasn't just a venue. It was the place where a woman with a guarded heart had once opened her door to a soaked stranger. The place where Dean had learned to fix shutters and, unknowingly, mend something deeper. And today it was where they'd promise forever. Becca stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom. Same view, same creaky floors. Her dress was simple ivory lace with a soft train. Her dark brown hair tucked in loose waves with a single pearl pin. She didn't stop the tears in her reflection. Downstairs, Dean waited. No tux. Just a crisp white shirt and a soft navy jacket. His hands were steady, but his heart beat like it had that first night on her porch. The ceremony was small, beautiful, sacred. Becca walked barefoot across the garden, down the path between rows of wildflowers. She didn't need anyone to give her away. She had already found herself long before she found him. When they stood before the officiant, hand in hand, no one cared about names or money. They saw a man and a woman who had been strangers, then companions, then anchors in each other's storms. Dean took her hand gently. "I came here trying to disappear," he said, voice warm with emotion. "Instead, I found the one person who saw me before I saw myself." Becca smiled, her eyes shining. "And I," she replied, "built walls so high I thought no one would ever climb them. But you didn't climb. You waited." When the vows were spoken and the rings slipped on, the applause was soft, but full of joy. Dean kissed her. Not like he was proving anything, but like he was finally home. That evening, under a blanket of stars, Dean led her to the edge of the cliffs, to where a wooden sign had just been posted. The Haven Project, a seaside retreat for families in need. Becca gasped softly. "I transferred the land," Dean said. "All of it is yours now, to shape into something that brings peace." "I thought you loved this place just the way it was," she whispered. "I love it because of what it gave me," he said. "Now I want it to give to others." She looked at him, overwhelmed. "How do you always know what my heart needs?" Dean stepped close, cupping her face. You thought I was just a lost traveler, he whispered. She smiled through tears. You were. He kissed her gently. And you, he murmured, were the one who brought me home.